Forget everything you think you know about fire-breathing monsters in fairy tales. In the ancient world, the dragon wasn't just a beast. It was the ultimate personification of cosmic chaos and impenetrable pride. Here's something most people never stop to question. The Bible mentions this creature from its very first pages to its very last. And yet almost no one realizes they've been reading about the same enemy the entire time. You've probably heard of Satan, the devil, the serpent in the garden. But what if all of these were never separate characters at all? What if Scripture has been describing one single being, using one single ancient symbol across thousands of years, and the identity hiding behind that symbol has been sitting in plain sight the whole time? That's the paradox at the heart of this story. A creature so feared, so consistently described across the entire Bible, yet so widely misunderstood by the very people who claim to know its meaning. Some picture a cartoonish villain with horns and a pitchfork. Others dismiss the whole idea as ancient superstition, nothing more than ink on old parchment. But Scripture tells a very different story, one far more unsettling and far more real. Because this isn't really a story about a monster. It's a story about deception disguised as freedom, pride disguised as strength. A war that began in a garden, moved through empires, erupted in the heavens themselves, and continues even now, in ways most people never notice until it's already too late. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The Bible doesn't just describe this enemy once. It reveals a pattern, repeated across centuries, exposing exactly how he operates, exactly what he wants, and exactly why he still matters today. Which means the real question was never whether this dragon exists. The real question is whether you'll finally recognize him. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what the Bible reveals about this ancient enemy, where he came from, why he was defeated, and why so many still fail to see him clearly, even now. Forget everything you think you know about fire-breathing monsters in fairy tales. In the ancient world, the dragon wasn't just a beast. It was the ultimate personification of cosmic chaos and impenetrable pride. We are uncovering the terrifying spiritual reality behind the scales and why this symbol represented a literal war for your soul. Long before Hollywood gave the dragon its wings of fantasy, an older, darker creature slithered through the pages of Scripture. It didn't breathe fire for spectacle. It breathed terror for a purpose. Ancient eyes that read these words didn't picture a fairy tale. They pictured something far worse, something real. Something watching. Picture the desert night, silent except for the wind dragging itself across the sand. Somewhere out there, storytellers whispered of a creature so vast it could swallow the sea, so old it predated memory itself. This wasn't entertainment. It was warning. A shadow moving beneath the surface of every page, waiting for the right moment to rise. Most people today know the dragon from movies, video games, medieval legends. Fire-breathing, treasure-hoarding, defeated by a brave knight in the end. But strip away the modern gloss, and something else emerges from the biblical text. Something with teeth sharper than fiction. This dragon doesn't guard gold. It guards the fate of nations. It doesn't burn castles. It burns faith. And here's what almost no one realizes. This creature doesn't just appear once in some obscure verse, easily overlooked. It slithers through the entire arc of Scripture. From the first shadows in a garden to the final chapters of a revelation no one fully understands. The dragon is there, watching, waiting, working. Why would a book about God's covenant with humanity spend so much ink on a monster? Why would prophets, poets, and apostles all return to this same haunting image, again and again, across centuries, across languages, across entirely different moments of history? Because this was never really about a creature at all. Something ancient is hiding inside this symbol, something that still moves in silence, still coils beneath the surface of the world described in these pages. And once you see what it truly represents, you'll never read the word dragon in the Bible the same way again. But to understand why this creature terrified an entire civilization, you first have to ask a far more unsettling question. Where does this dragon actually come from? And why does it never seem to fully disappear from the biblical story? Most assume the dragon belongs only to the final book of Scripture, locked away in the strange visions of Revelation, far from everyday reading. But that assumption is wrong, dead wrong. Long before John saw his apocalyptic visions on the island of Patmos, the dragon was already coiling through psalms, prophecies, and ancient poetry, hiding in plain sight for anyone willing to look closer. Go back to the oldest layers of Hebrew Scripture, and the sea itself becomes something monstrous, something alive. The ancient world feared the deep waters, believing chaos itself lived beneath the waves, a force older than creation, older than order itself. And within that chaos, something massive stirred, something the prophets and poets called by name the dragon, the sea serpent, Leviathan, Rahab. Different names, same shadow. Listen to the psalmist's words and something unsettling rises to the surface. God doesn't merely observe this creature. He fights it. He crushes its heads. He tramples it beneath the waters like a conqueror silencing a rebellion. Why would ancient worship include such violent imagery unless something violent was truly being described? This wasn't poetry for poetry's sake. This was memory, warning, testimony, and it doesn't stop with the sea. Empires themselves become dragons in the prophetic imagination. Egypt, the great power that once enslaved God's people, is called a dragon lying in the depths of its own rivers, prideful and monstrous, believing itself untouchable. Babylon, the empire that swallowed nations whole, is painted with the same terrifying brush. Kingdoms drunk on power, kingdoms that crushed the weak beneath their feet. All wear the same ancient mask. Why would the Bible reach for this same monstrous image again and again, across centuries, across radically different moments of history? Why would prophets describing political empires and psalmists describing cosmic chaos all converge on the exact same symbol? Because something deeper links them all together. Pride, domination, opposition to God's order. Every tyrant, every empire, every force of chaos that ever rose against heaven's plan seems to inherit the same terrifying nature, as if one single spirit moves behind them all, wearing different crowns, speaking different languages, ruling different centuries, yet always the same monstrous heart beating underneath. This is no coincidence. This is a pattern too consistent, too deliberate, too ancient to ignore. The dragon isn't confined to one book, one prophet, one moment in history. It moves like a thread stitched through the entire fabric of Scripture, appearing wherever chaos rises against divine order, wherever pride declares war on heaven itself. But if the dragon has been present since the earliest pages of the Bible, disguised in seas and empires and ancient nightmares, then somewhere, at some point, this creature must have a beginning, a first appearance, a moment where the mask comes off and its true identity is finally revealed. Go back. Further than empires, further than psalms, further than prophecy itself. Go back to a garden, quiet and perfect, where the first shadow of the dragon ever touched human history. Not as a monster with scales and wings, but as something far more dangerous. Something that could speak. Something that could lie. A serpent moves through the trees, subtle, patient, calculated. It doesn't roar. It doesn't threaten. It simply asks a question, soft and curious, planting a single seed of doubt into the mind of the first woman. Did God really say that? 6 words. That's all it took. 6 words to unravel paradise, to fracture trust between humanity and its creator, to open a wound that would bleed through every generation that followed. No fire. No claws, no violence at all. Just a whisper, wrapped in half-truths, dressed as wisdom. And humanity believed it. For centuries, this serpent seemed like nothing more than a strange episode in an ancient story. A talking snake, a forbidden fruit, a tragic mistake. But Scripture refuses to let this creature fade quietly into myth. It resurfaces, again and again, until finally, in the last book of the Bible, the mask is torn away completely, and the identity of this serpent is revealed in words too clear to misunderstand. The great dragon, the ancient serpent. The one called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Read those words slowly. Let them settle. This is not a new villain introduced at the end of the story. This is the same enemy from the very beginning, wearing a different name, playing a longer game. The serpent in the garden and the dragon in Revelation are one and the same being, separated not by identity, but by the passing of thousands of years and the unfolding of an entire redemptive story, which means this was never a battle, confined to one moment in Eden. It was the opening scene of a war stretching across the entire span of human history, a war fought not with swords or armies, but with lies, half-truths, and the twisting of God's own words. Suddenly, every empire drowning in pride, every kingdom crushing the weak, every act of chaos rising against divine order across the pages of Scripture begins to make a chilling kind of sense. Behind them all moves the same ancient strategist, the same patient liar, the same creature who once whispered in a garden and never truly stopped whispering since. But if deception was this creature's opening move, the very first weapon he ever used against humanity, then perhaps his greatest danger was never his strength, his size, or his fury. Perhaps it was something far quieter, far more difficult to see coming. Picture the dragon as the world imagines it, fire pouring from its jaws, cities collapsing into ash, armies scattering before its roar. That's the image fixed in modern minds. Powerful, loud, impossible to miss. But the Bible tells a very different story, and it's far more unsettling than any flame could ever be. The true weapon of this ancient enemy was never destruction you could see coming. It was deception you never saw at all. Think back to the garden. No fire fell from the sky. No beast tore through paradise. Just a question, gentle and reasonable, slipping past every defense humanity had. That single strategy proved so effective, so devastating, that Scripture shows it being used again and again, century after century, disguised in 1,000 different forms, idols carved from wood and stone, promising power, fertility, protection, everything God had already offered freely. False prophets whispering comfortable lies while true warnings went ignored. Kings and empires convinced of their own invincibility, blind to the collapse quietly gathering beneath their feet. Every single time the pattern repeats. Not fire, not force, just deception. Dressed as freedom, dressed as wisdom, dressed as a better way forward. This is what made the enemy so dangerous. Fire announces itself. Fire can be seen, fought, feared, and prepared for. But a lie slips in quietly, disguised as something reasonable, something even good. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like a choice, a harmless one, until the damage is already done, and there's no realizing what happened until it's far too late to turn back. Scripture paints this deceiver with chilling precision. Not merely a liar, but the father of lies itself. Not simply cunning, but a master of disguise, capable of appearing as something beautiful, something trustworthy, even something that looks like light itself. That single detail should stop anyone cold. The greatest danger was never something that looked monstrous. It was something that looked good. And so the true battlefield was never a field of ash and fire. It was the human heart, the mind, the will. Every temptation whispered the same underlying promise the serpent once made in the garden. You can have more. You can know more. You can become more, without ever needing God at all. The wrapping changes with every era, every culture, every generation. The lie underneath never does. This is why the dragon needed no army in these early strategies. No war machine. No conquest by force. Just enough silence, enough shadow, enough carefully placed doubt to turn hearts away from truth, one whispered lie at a time. But if deception alone could accomplish so much, quietly corrupting nations and individuals across centuries without a single drop of blood spilled by force. Then what happens when whispers are no longer enough? What happens when this ancient enemy turns to something far more visible, far more violent, against those who refuse to be deceived? When lies stop working, something darker takes their place. Scripture doesn't hide this shift. It shows it plainly, painfully, across generation after generation. Once deception fails to turn a heart away from God, the dragon changes tactics. Whispers become chains. Shadows become swords, and those who remain faithful discover a terrifying truth. Standing firm has always come at a cost. Walk through the pages of biblical history, and this pattern never fades. Prophets silenced, some by exile, some by death, simply for refusing to bend their words to please a king instead of God. Righteous men thrown into pits, into furnaces, into dens of hungry lions, not for crimes committed, but for loyalty that refused to break. Entire communities of believers scattered, hunted, pressed beneath the weight of empires that saw faith itself as a threat too dangerous to ignore. Why would earthly powers care so deeply about a people who asked only to worship freely? Why would kings burn with such fury over convictions that threatened no army, no throne, no border? Because Scripture reveals something far larger moving behind these human conflicts. Every persecution, every act of violence against the faithful becomes another skirmish in a war that was never merely political. It was spiritual, ancient, and utterly relentless. Feel the weight of what it must have meant to stand inside a furnace built to consume you. Flames roaring close enough to feel their hunger, and still refuse to renounce your God. Feel the isolation of a prophet abandoned by his own nation, hunted by his own king, surrounded by enemies on every side, yet still speaking truth into a silence that longed to swallow him whole. This was never simply human cruelty. This was the dragon's fury finding a human hand to wield, and this fury never remains satisfied with silence alone. It escalates. It multiplies. It follows the faithful across centuries, changing faces, changing empires, changing the tools of persecution, yet never changing its ultimate target. Those who refuse to abandon their God, no matter the price demanded of them. Every act of endurance then becomes something far greater than survival. Every believer who refused to bow becomes a living testimony that this ancient enemy, despite all his power, could never fully win. Chains could bind bodies, flames could threaten flesh, but something inside these faithful souls remained untouchable, a flame the dragon could never extinguish, no matter how fiercely he tried. This relentless pursuit reveals something the dragon perhaps never intended to expose. An urgency, a desperation, as if this war was never meant to last forever, as if this creature somehow already knew that his time to strike was limited. But if the dragon fights with such fury against individual believers scattered across centuries, what happens when he turns his full strength toward something far greater? What happens when this ancient war expands beyond isolated persecution into an alliance with earthly powers themselves? Something shifts in the story now. The dragon no longer fights alone. Scripture pulls back the curtain on a darker alliance, one that stretches persecution into something far more organized, far more terrifying. No longer isolated attacks against scattered believers. Now an empire rises, a beast emerges from the depths, and the dragon himself hands it power. Picture the vision as it was written. A monstrous beast climbing out of the sea, crowned with heads and horns, dripping with blasphemy, wearing the authority of nations like a garment stolen from heaven itself. And standing behind it, granting it strength, granting it a throne, granting it dominion over the earth, stands the dragon. Not merely tempting, not merely deceiving one heart at a time, now empowering an entire system built to oppose God on a global scale. This is the moment the war stops feeling personal and starts feeling cosmic. Every kingdom that has ever crushed the weak beneath its ambition, every empire drunk on its own invincibility seems to echo this ancient pattern. Power granted from below, disguised as glory from above. The beast doesn't create its own authority. It receives it, inherited from the same ancient enemy who once whispered lies in a garden, who once crushed prophets beneath the fury of kings. And where the beast rises, worship follows. Not worship of God, but worship of power itself. Nations bowing before strength, before dominance, before whatever promises safety and greatness in a world drowning in chaos. Scripture paints this moment with chilling clarity. The whole world marveling, following, worshiping the very power the dragon has quietly assembled behind the scenes. This is deception evolved into something structural, something political. Something the entire world can participate in without even realizing whose authority they're truly bowing before. Feel the scale of what's unfolding. This isn't a solitary tyrant seduced by pride. This isn't one nation crushing another for territory or gold. This is a spiritual alliance, ancient and calculated, using earthly power as its instrument, preparing the world stage for something far greater than any single empire could ever accomplish alone. And beneath the surface of this rising beast, a question begins to surface, one too unsettling to ignore. If the dragon can grant such staggering authority to powers rising against heaven itself, what happens when heaven finally decides to respond? What happens when this ancient enemy, who has waited, deceived, and empowered kingdoms across centuries, finally comes face to face with the very forces he has spent an eternity opposing? Because Scripture doesn't leave that question unanswered for long. It shows a battle, not on earth, not fought with human armies. A battle in heaven itself, one that will change everything that follows. Silence falls first, then the sound of wings, thousands of them, filling a space no human eye was ever meant to witness. Heaven itself becomes a battlefield, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Scripture describes an actual war erupting among the stars, a conflict so violent it would forever change the fate of everything beneath it. Michael and his angels rise up. Across from them, the dragon and the forces loyal to him. Two armies clash in a realm beyond human sight, in a war older than any battle ever recorded on Earth, deciding a conflict that had been building since a single act of rebellion first shattered heaven's perfect order. Feel the weight of that moment. Something ancient, something proud, believing itself powerful enough to challenge heaven's throne, hurling itself against the very armies of God. And for a moment, the outcome hangs suspended, terrifying, uncertain to anyone watching from below. But the dragon does not win. Scripture describes his defeat with brutal finality. Cast down, thrown out, stripped of his place among the stars, hurled toward the earth with a fury that would only intensify what came next. No longer welcome in the halls of heaven, this ancient enemy finds himself exiled to the one place left where his influence could still reach, the world of men. Picture the horror of that fall. Not weakness, not surrender. Rage. A being who once stood among the highest ranks of heaven, now cast down toward humanity itself, carrying with him a fury sharpened by humiliation and loss. This wasn't the end of his war. It was the beginning of its most dangerous chapter, because a dragon expelled from heaven doesn't simply vanish into defeat. He turns his eyes toward Earth, toward the very people he has hunted since the garden, since the furnaces, since the beasts he empowered to conquer nations. Only now, something has changed. Something has been lost. And that loss will make him more desperate, more dangerous, more relentless than ever before. This single moment reframes everything that came before it. Every persecution, every empire, every whispered lie suddenly reads differently, knowing that behind it all stood a being who had already tasted defeat in a battle far greater than anything fought on Earth. And it raises a question too unsettling to ignore. If the dragon has already lost the war in heaven, if his defeat has already been sealed in a realm beyond human sight, why does his fury on Earth only seem to grow stronger? Why would a defeated enemy fight even harder rather than surrender? Because Scripture reveals something the dragon himself already understands, something that terrifies him more than any army ever could. Fear does strange things to power, even ancient cosmic power. Scripture reveals something almost unthinkable. The dragon himself is afraid. Not of losing eventually, of losing soon. Cast down from heaven, stripped of his place among the stars, this ancient enemy now moves across the earth carrying a terrible awareness that most never stop to consider. His time is running out, and he knows it. Picture the fury of a creature who understands the countdown has already begun. Not calm, not calculated the way he once whispered in a garden. This is desperation now, wild and consuming, the kind that makes a defeated enemy more dangerous, not less. Scripture describes it in words meant to unsettle. Great wrath, because he knows his time is short. Feel what that phrase actually means. A being who once patiently waited centuries to corrupt nations, who once played the long game across generations of empires and prophets, now finds himself racing against a clock he cannot stop. And a cornered enemy, aware that defeat approaches, doesn't retreat quietly. He strikes harder, faster, with less restraint than ever before. This explains the intensity that seems to build with every passing age. Persecution doesn't fade with time. In some seasons, it sharpens. Deception doesn't loosen its grip. It multiplies, spreading through new voices, new systems, new disguises the ancient serpent never needed in the garden. Every strategy accelerates, every lie grows bolder. Every attack against the faithful carries the weight of a being who understands that opportunities are closing, one by one, as the final chapters of the story draw nearer. This is not the behavior of something confident in eternal victory. This is the behavior of something cornered, watching the walls close in, unwilling to surrender without inflicting as much damage as possible before the end arrives. And there's something almost haunting in this realization. The very fear driving the dragon's fury is rooted in a truth he cannot escape, a truth Scripture has already declared long before this moment of desperation ever began. His outcome was never actually in question. His defeat was never something still being decided in real time. It was already determined, long before his wrath reached its peak, long before his war against the faithful ever intensified, which raises a question far more important than his fury itself. If this ancient enemy already knows deep within himself that his time is short and his defeat inevitable, why does Scripture insist so firmly that his ending was never uncertain to begin with? What does it mean that a being still capable of such devastation on earth is, in truth, already living out the final days of a war he has already lost? Here is the truth the dragon fears most. His ending was never actually in doubt. Not for a single moment. Beneath every act of fury, every lie whispered across centuries, every empire he empowered, and every believer he hunted, one unshakable reality remained fixed from the very beginning. His defeat had already been decided, long before he ever raised his voice against heaven itself. Scripture doesn't treat this as a distant possibility, hoped for, but uncertain. It treats it as settled fact. A victory already secured, sealed not by human strength, not by armies, not by centuries of struggle, but by a single act that shattered the dragon's power at its very foundation. The moment a cross stood against a darkening sky, something ancient and terrible received a wound it could never recover from. Feel the weight of that irony. The dragon believed his greatest triumph would come through death, through destruction, through the silencing of the very one prophecy had long pointed toward. Instead, that death became the blow that broke him completely. What looked like defeat to human eyes was, in truth, the exact moment his fate was forever sealed. This is why his fury only intensifies even now, not because victory remains uncertain, but because it doesn't. A defeated enemy raging against an outcome he can no longer change is far more dangerous in his final moments than he ever was at the height of his power. Every lie, every act of persecution, every desperate strategy in these last days is not the behavior of a conqueror. It is the thrashing of something already cornered, already unmasked, already awaiting a judgment it cannot escape. And Scripture describes that judgment with chilling finality. A lake of fire, a final end, not just for the beast, not just for the false powers he once empowered, but for the dragon himself, the ancient serpent, the deceiver who once dared to challenge heaven. Cast down once, expelled from the stars above, cast down again, this time forever, into a fate from which there is no rising, no rebellion, no return. This is the ending Scripture has quietly been building toward across every chapter, every empire, every whispered temptation since the garden itself. Not an uncertain conclusion, a guaranteed one, a fire that will finally silence the same voice that first whispered doubt into human hearts, the same fury that once hunted prophets, the same authority once handed to beasts and empires convinced of their own invincibility. But if this outcome has already been written, if the dragon's defeat has already been sealed by a victory achieved long ago, one unsettling question still remains. If his ending was decided before it even began, why does his presence still stir fear? Why does his influence still linger? In a world that has not yet witnessed the final chapter play out? If his defeat was already sealed, why does the story of the dragon still feel unfinished? Why does something written thousands of years ago still stir unease in hearts that read it now? Scripture never intended this ancient enemy to remain locked inside the past, a myth confined to garden shadows and fallen empires. His strategies, his patterns, his very nature were recorded for a reason far greater than history alone. Consider the pattern once more, stripped of its ancient robes. Deception disguised as wisdom, pride disguised as strength, lies whispered gently enough to feel like freedom rather than chains. These were never strategies bound to one era, one empire, one civilization long since turned to dust. They were revealed precisely because they would echo forward, generation after generation, taking new shapes while keeping the same ancient heart. Feel the unsettling truth hiding inside this realization. The same voice that once questioned words spoken in a garden still finds new ways to whisper the exact same question into human hearts today. Did God really say, the same fury that once hunted prophets and believers still searches for hearts willing to compromise, to bend, to quietly drift from truth without ever recognizing the drift at all? Scripture doesn't record this history simply to satisfy curiosity about ancient battles fought in realms beyond human sight. It records this history as warning, etched deliberately into sacred pages, so that every generation reading these words might recognize the same patterns rising again in their own time, wearing different masks, speaking different languages, yet moving with the same ancient hunger. This is why the dragon still matters. Not because the battle in heaven remains uncertain, not because his defeat still hangs in question, but because the tactics that defined his war since the beginning continue rippling forward, testing every generation with the same ancient temptations dressed in modern disguise. Feel the weight of what it means to live inside a story still unfolding, even after its ending has already been written. The final chapter is secure. The outcome is settled. Yet the days remaining before that final judgment are filled with the same deception, the same pride, the same desperate fury that has defined this ancient enemy since a serpent first slithered through paradise. And this raises the final, haunting question Scripture leaves behind for every reader willing to listen closely. If the identity of this ancient enemy has already been revealed with such chilling clarity, if his tactics have remained unchanged since the very beginning, Why do so many still fail to recognize him even now, moving quietly behind the very lies he continues to tell? Strip away the scales. Strip away the fire, the wings, the terror of ancient imagination. What remains is something far more haunting than any creature could ever be. The dragon was never simply a monster meant to frighten readers across centuries. He was a mirror, held up against the darkest truths of human history, reflecting rebellion, deception, and the oldest war ever fought. Every empire that ever crushed the weak beneath its pride wore his image. Every lie whispered gently enough to feel like freedom carried his voice. Every persecution endured by the faithful. Every kingdom empowered against heaven's order. Every desperate act of fury in these final days. All of it traces back to the same ancient enemy, first revealed in a garden, and finally unmasked in a vision on a distant island. This was never truly a story about scales and wings. It was a story about rebellion against the very order of heaven, about pride so consuming it dared to challenge the throne of God itself, about deception so patient it could wait centuries, adapting its disguise, never once abandoning its ancient purpose, and about a battle between light and darkness so vast it stretched from paradise, lost to a judgment still waiting to unfold. Feel the weight of that revelation settling now. The garden, the empires, the furnaces, the cosmic war in heaven, the beast rising from the sea, the fury of a defeated enemy racing against a closing clock. Every thread was always connected, woven together since the very beginning. Pointing toward this single truth, Scripture has been unveiling one page at a time. The dragon was never simply defeated in some distant, disconnected moment. His defeat was always the destination of a much larger story, one written long before his fury ever reached its peak. One sealed the moment a cross broke his power at its very root. And yet, despite every warning, every ancient pattern laid bare across the pages of Scripture, despite an identity revealed with such staggering clarity from Eden to Revelation, something remains unresolved. Not in the story itself, in those who read it. Because if the Bible has already revealed who the dragon truly is, why do so many people still fail to recognize his real identity? So here's the question worth sitting with. If the identity of this ancient enemy has already been revealed so clearly, from a garden in Eden to a vision on a distant island, why do so many still walk right past him without ever noticing? Maybe it's because deception was always designed to feel invisible. Maybe it's because pride still whispers the same old lie. You don't need to worry about this. But now you know better. What part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the war in heaven? The dragon's growing fury as his time runs short? Or the fact that his defeat was already sealed before it even happened? Let me know in the comments below. If this opened your eyes to something you'd never noticed in Scripture before, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it too. And if you want more stories like this one, uncovering the truths hidden in plain sight throughout the Bible, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what we uncover next.